Okay. So today's agenda will be focusing on navigating the fiscal side of the House. The legislature and the governor play a critical role in development and adoption of the state budget process. Those are your key players at the state level. I'll discuss then the state budget walkthrough of what are the critical points that matter. And as an advocate, what are the things that you need to be aware of to be effective? And then how to develop your message. So as I mentioned yesterday, and I wanted to do just a quick recap, this time around, I flipped the slides. Instead of showing you the legislature first, I'm showing you the governor and what the governor's role and responsibilities are. This is where the governor does dominate. Any governor in any administration dominates the conversation because they're the first ones. And I can't wait for the day that we say she's the first one to set out the fiscal agenda on what the state's top priorities will be. Every governor gets to lay out that information come January 10th. By statute, the governor has to release his or hers budget proposal. They determine that information based on what the state revenues look like. That's information that's happening on a monthly basis. We're all paying our taxes every day. California is a progressive state. We tend to lean more on our personal income tax. So when we have a lot of folks working, our personal income tax is up. When we have, unfortunately, high number of unemployment, that means the state is not generating that money. And when you have high levels of unemployment, guess what else is low? Your sales tax. We all use our revenues that we generate to buy commodities, to buy products, to buy goods and services. So it's all interconnected. So unlike other states, I'll use Texas for example, they survive off of their property tax. They're much more leaning on the value of their homes versus California, although California is just an expensive state overall. So the governor makes sure to propose a budget that lays out the foundation of what his top priorities will be. And in that budget, we will start recognizing, is this administration going to be focusing on education, on housing, what may have? This administration that we're currently seeing has a lot of issues that has come out in support. And so if there's some issue that you've seen that your organization wants to move forward, make sure to pay attention. How long this administration writes about 300 to 400 pages of their analysis that they release. Is any of that information that they're releasing when January 10th comes out relating back to your specific issue? Did you help them in the fall build out those talking points of why improving our housing situation is going to lead to an economic recovery? Are your organizations involved in coming up with some of the critical solutions? Because remember, these elected officials, they're representing their communities, and the stakeholders that are the loudest, more organized, and have credible solutions with real data behind them tend to make it through this budget. And then there's other politicians that are also involved. So don't forget that every agency also plays a role. They all submit something called the budget change proposals, BCPs, because we got to love our acronyms. So BCPs are what each department submits in the fall to the Department of Finance, which is the right hand to the administration. That's how they decide which are the top issues that every agency still needs to address. What we're continuing to hear is that this state is generating additional revenues. We're getting a higher amount of funding than expected. So the economic growth is still continuing in the state. This is a great time for every organization, every stakeholder, every category of discussion that has to do with improving the lives of our constituents is super critical, because there finally is enough resources that can cover many of these facets. But are we conveying that information right now in this time before that January 10th deadline? So the key information here is don't wait until Jan 10 to tell them, hey, I have a great idea. Start working your idea now. And then the governor can also sign sign or veto legislation, and they can line item the fiscal amounts in a budget appropriations bill or in a legislative proposal, but they can't deduct actual statutory language on how to effectuate the change, the policy that they're trying to modify. Administration can only line item the amount, the money. So that's very critical when we're having very difficult budget negotiations, difficult budget environments. When we were under the Great Recession with Governor Schwarzenegger, we would negotiate. We used to have to need the Republicans, and we would get something called the poison pill list, and they would give us all the cuts that they wanted on the social services side. And then the governor at that time would line item some of our funding appropriations to reduce the funding that was going to social services, which was very horrendous and a very difficult time to experience. So they could do good things or they could do some bad things. For the legislature, in the state of California, we have 120 elected officials that represent the legislative districts. On the assembly side, we have 80 assembly members, 60 Democrats, 19 Republicans, and 1 independent. And they seek election every 2 years. So every 2 years, you'll start seeing campaigns come up, their names pop up, and guess what they're doing prior to that campaign season? They're trying to get to know their constituents. Their goal and responsibilities is to represent their constituents. So if you have any opportunities to engage them as early as possible. And remember, they're trying to get their names out there that second year. They represent about 500,000 constituents, and their term limit overall is a total of 12 years. On the Senate side, there's 40 senators, 31 Democrats, 9 Republicans, and they seek re-election every 4 years. So they have a little bit of a longer time frame. They represent about 1 million constituents, and their term limit is also 12 years total. The good thing about this is that they can now be here. They can now focus on a longer term agenda. So don't forget that if you know your senators here for the long haul, are there issues that you can start building today that eventually can come to fruition? Not everything happens overnight. Some causes we need to build them. And so it's important to start identifying your champions of who has longevity, who just arrived, who's new, who's seasoned, and who has expertise in your particular issue area. The legislature approves, modifies, or rejects the governor's proposal. As I had mentioned yesterday, this legislature is very seasoned. They have taken a lot of liberty and have significantly modified the administration's budget proposals. So what that tells you is this administration has to work a lot harder to get their vision done, because they have to make sure to negotiate with as many politicians as possible. So that also provides an avenue for advocates to recognize which politicians are seasoned and are experts at getting their way. And if they're good at being strategic in modifying the state budget, can you start activating and can you start communicating with those champions to get your budget requests adopted as part of the final budget process? They adopt the budget trailer bills and the budget bills, which I'll discuss in detail when we're in the section of speaking the language. They only need a simple majority now to pass a budget. They do need 2/3 votes to pass things that have to do with raising taxes or proposing constitutional amendments. That's the only time the legislature needs a 2/3 vote. But guess what? Right now, the Democrats have a 2/3 vote in both Assembly and the Senate. However, we do have moderate Democrats in the Central Valley region and the Inland Empire area where you're all located. So those are things to recognize, that just because they have a certain designation doesn't mean they always vote a specific way. And so recognizing that importance, if the goal is to raise a tax to pass a proposition, for us, the proposition that we're going to be pushing next year is a school bond under AB 75 by Assemblymember O'Donnell. That requires a 2/3 vote because it will need to be passed through the ballot process. So make it into an initiative and then get voters support for it. So we need 2/3 vote. As I mentioned yesterday, the legislative process is very critical. The reason being that many of the policy proposals that elected officials adopt require resources. And so the reason I'm showing you the legislative side of the House, that begins in January, and in the first year, it ends in September. The governor has until October 10th to then sign or veto legislation. The second year, because every legislative cycle runs in 2-year cycles. The second year is shorter because it's an election year. That ends in August. And let me tell you, we all look forward to August because your advocates are very tired by then. September is a harsh time. It's too long. But because we know that there's this legislative process going on, we have to figure out, does it align with timing the state budget? Do we know if we're going to get increased revenues? Can we activate then more members and more folks to call in to support a piece of legislation because the timing is right, because the state has resources, because we can finance these programs, and identifying those pots of resources to then align it with the policy proposals that we're proposing. Because when you're in the policy process, your bills, which then go through a policy committee specific to the issue area. So an education bill goes to an Assembly or Senate Education Committee. A labor bill goes through Assembly or a Senate Labor Committee. Because it's all issue specific, we also have to inform the consultants who are analyzing these bills. How are we going to finance these ideas? And this is where it's important to pay attention to your state agencies. The more you talk to the departments that would be administrating this program or a grant or making the modifications to make it take effect, letting them know you want to make these changes, getting their buy-in, because guess what? Those are the people who are doing the jobs. Kai and Julian used to be the folks that I would I won't say harass. I went kindly into their offices, making my request for additional resources for schools because our students needed it, but making sure, did it make sense and can the department implement these changes? And if they both said, not the way you have it, then I had to be willing to amend my proposal in a way that makes sense. So something that was mentioned yesterday, please don't fall in love with your ideas. Make sure that you recognize that they're great ideas, but great ideas always need to be beefed up. And that happens through this legislative process that takes place in Sacramento. So speaking the language, I'll quickly go through this so that we could go back to the budget part, but it's important to understand the acronyms when we're here in Sacramento in terms of what's a bill and what's a budget bill. So a bill is a proposal that changes, repeals, or modifies and adds to an existing law. On the assembly side, an assembly member introduces something called an assembly bill, AB. You will always hear those letters before a number. A number designates the order that those bill ideas were filed. And let me tell you, there are some politicians who have favorite numbers, so their poor staff sits in front of a desk waiting for a darn number to show up. They're literally standing there with their bill idea, waiting to hear number 37, 35. Okay, someone come get 36. And then when they hear 37, they put down their piece of paper so that idea becomes an SB or an AB 37. So that's an interesting process too, that you could sometimes select the number that you want, but you have to torture your staffer to stay there and get that specific number. And some members have done it. Senator Gil Cedillo was known for this driver ID bill, and they would always get the same number every year. But at least it helps you as a constituent, as an advocate, that every year you're fighting for the same issue and it's the same number. On the Senate side, a senator introduces something called a Senate bill, and then it's followed by a number. And then there's different other categories that most of us on the advocacy side, we tend to stay away from, but those acronyms are there for your information. And then I did want to mention that there is something called the gut and amend process, that even though the deadline to introduce legislation is mid-February, that doesn't mean that you don't have a second bite at the apple later on in the process, the 9-month process. There is an ability to take a piece of legislation that's no longer moving forward and take its contents out and replace it with a different idea. And many of the times this solution, the gut and amend process, is used because there's an emergency, because there's a wildfire and we need to make sure that we have the resources to cover the costs, because we need to beef up CAL FIRE or Cal OES, the Office of Emergency Services. So there is a loophole in the legislative process to adopt legislation. And so I just wanted to point that out for you. On the state budget process, it begins January 10th. As I mentioned, the governor's office and the Department of Finance spent all of the fall meeting with their state agency, meeting with advocates, hearing folks out, reading reports. So if your organizations do reports, make sure to have these staffers in your distribution. So if there's reports that you're working on that are going to be the basis of a policy idea, make sure that you're submitting that information as well. February through April. So both the Assembly and the Senate have dedicated staff that analyze the budget process. They're called the Assembly Budget Committee and the Senate Budget Committee, Budget and Fiscal Review Committee. And they have professional staff. Just like the legislative policy process that has staffers that are issue specific, in the Senate and Assembly Budget Committee offices, they have dedicated staffers who work on those specific issues. When I worked in the legislature during the Great Recession, I had Sub 2, which is the Education Finance Committee, administering the higher education assignment and the early education assignment in childcare. And then I also had Sub 4, which was general government assignment. I used to handle the labor, workforce, and EDD issues. And so those were two different committees, two different sets of politicians that work those issues. So from February through April, the staffers and the members that sit in those subcommittees hold hearings every week, almost on a weekly basis. And the place that you could find these weekly agendas and information is on assembly.ca.gov or senate.ca.gov. If you go under daily file, you could see the schedule. It posts all the hearings that everyone's working on a weekly basis. And then when you click under committees, you could read the analysis of each of the proposals that the Assembly and the Senate are reviewing. And as advocates, you can submit a letter, a statement, letting the legislature know where you lie in terms of the governor's proposals. Are you in support? Would you like some modifications? Or do you think that there's a better way to improve it and will unfortunately have to oppose this idea? Or you can testify. Once public hearings begin, the public is invited to participate, and we are the public, and we have to engage. These members may not always be the subject matter experts. They might be interested in the topic, but may not be the subject matter experts. So don't lose sight that there is this opportunity. And so just because an administration proposes something doesn't mean that it will happen. We have to activate folks to modify it if we don't like a certain proposal, or if we want modifications or an augmentation in resources, we need to make sure that our voices are heard. And then we all await for May 14th, a month after we all pay taxes, because again, the state of California relies on personal income tax. The state has to figure out how much money has it collected, how much resources are there available, and then we see an update to the governor's January proposals. The administration either modifies and increases categories of funding for each of their programs or makes changes and removes proposals and changes information out. So May 14th is very critical for us in Sacramento. We're constantly refreshing dof.ca.gov's website to read what that analysis looks like. What are the modifications? How much more money is the state getting? Is it good? Is it coming to us? Is it one time? Is it ongoing? So many questions. As you can tell, we could nerd out all day while hitting refresh. Then May through June, the legislature has an entire month to review, to modify, approve, or reject any of these additional modifications in the May revision. It's a very hectic time because remember, at the same time, the legislative process is going on and having fiscal committee hearings. So at the same time, we're deliberating on policy bills that have a fiscal implication, and then we're reviewing the administration's requests. And the legislature is coming out with their own statement of, do we support this? Does it meet our agenda? Does it align with their platform? Because every administration, the Assembly has a speaker who's the leader of the Assembly. The Senate has a president pro tem who is the leader of the Senate. They have their own political agenda. And then each of the caucuses, based on racial and ethnic demographics, also have their political and fiscal agenda. Are the administration's proposals aligning to all of those things? If not, there's going to be some serious negotiations going on here. And then we get to June 15, which is an exciting time. I know that most of the people who heard me yesterday know what June 15 means, but any of the new people, do you know what happens on June 15 if the legislature does not pass an on-time budget? I don't remember Gina's name, so I am going to call out people if you do know what happens on June 15 if the legislature does not pass a budget. I'm going to give you 10 seconds while I drink my coffee.
They don't get paid.
They don't get paid. They don't get paid, which is awesome. So now we have on-time budgets. It's awesome.
Yes.
Thank you, Pam. They don't get paid. So it's really interesting, the incentive that generates when people know that their own finances are at stake. And I had mentioned yesterday that in 2010, the legislature passed a 100-day late budget. Did not go into effect. We didn't have it passed to the Governor Schwarzenegger at the time, until October 8th. It was bad. It was not a good thing, because unless you're a constitutional institution, which school districts are, which UC is, not a lot of folks receive their state checks and their state resources. And so there were a lot of agencies going, what am I supposed to do? And that also included the legislature. When you work for the legislature, you're in this special category with zero protections because you're at will. And I had mentioned that I had to run over to Golden One, which thank gosh is located right in front of the Capitol, and get a zero interest loan so I could continue paying my bills at my home. And that was just a very stressful time. And because of that, we ended up with Proposition 25, which has changed the laws. It now requires the legislature to adopt a balanced budget, not just a budget, but also a balanced budget. And it reminds them and it penalizes them to permanently forfeit their pay. So they cannot be retroactively paid. They would have to forfeit for as many days as the budget is late. So that has been a welcome relief in Sacramento, because now we're seeing on-time budgets. And then the fiscal year starts July 1st. So I wanted to showcase what's taking place in 2021, 2022, just to give you a sense of how much resources are we talking about here in California. So the state budget is not just made out of state revenues. Many of us do live in state land, but for schools, a lot of our funding does come from federal government and local property taxes. This year, just like last, it's an anomaly. We've seen a huge infusion of federal funds, almost $150 billion more. So these are in billions. As you could tell, 42% of this year's budget is made out of federal funds, 43% of state general funds. The top three revenue sources of general funds are corporate, sales, and personal income tax. Then you see bond funds. Those are the dollars that pay for infrastructure, for your highways. And if you're in Sacramento, every freeway is under construction, so please be careful. It's very scary because every freeway is under construction. And then special funds, those are particular, think of DMV. We all pay a license fee. We have highway fees, you have a gas tax, oil tax. So those are all these particular niche fees that then pay out a particular source of a program on the right side of the slide. On the right side of the slide deck, what I just did, and when you get the slides, I just updated them, so I'll send these out to Julian this morning. You could go into the Excel sheet behind the pie chart to see the actual amounts, but I just wanted to show you percent-wise, where is the state really investing their resources? And so what you could see is that there's this, there's been just a shift. You saw 10 years ago versus today. Health and Human Services is at 32% of our state revenue, and education is about 26%. If you add higher education, then that takes us a little higher than Health and Human Services. Because we're living in a pandemic, a health pandemic, we're seeing more resources going to Health and Human Services because that's where the need is. And then the other chunk is predominantly in our world of education. Then you see workforce, government operations. Yes, Kai?
I thought, to your point, that was my question. I thought education needed to get like a minimum of like 40% or something like that. Is that not the case anymore, or?
If we're in a test 2, I think it's if we're in test 2 and we're in test 1. There's 3 tests. Because we love our tests and we love our formulas and none of it makes sense. We should aspire to get a minimum funding level, but unfortunately the way education is financed, it really is on our overall population. And so when we're seeing declines in enrollment, families right now more than ever have the ability to make decisions based on their personal beliefs. They could opt for private charter schools, although charter schools receive state funding. Some families have relocated because of the cost of California. And so what we're seeing is just an overall decline. And one good thing is people are getting educated, getting college education degrees, and we're seeing a decline in just the terms of how many children are being born and were born 5 years ago to now enter our system. So we're just seeing an overall decline, which then leads to schools getting less money. I wish we could focus on paying education for what it costs to serve the child, to make sure that they have all the services versus how many children do we have, because we all recognize, as you're looking at your nonprofits and your organizations, a service might not align to a specific person because every constituent may need a different set of situations and support systems. And some might be a little bit more affordable than others. And then you see housing, transportation, natural resources, and environmental protection. All of those categories have become top key issues because not only are we surviving a pandemic, but we have wildfires, mudslides, and drought affecting the state of California. So those are key areas that have dominated the discussion this particular legislative and budget year. So I will take a second to pause and look at your questions just in case. I know, thank you, Kai, for putting all the links. I just want to make sure that I'm not missing anything. Okay, perfect. So speaking the language, I think it's important to learn the key words. And every space that we're in, right, we have just different verbiage and terminology. So Inc. in Sacramento, when we're talking about the governor's proposed budget, what that means is that it's the report that shows the spending from the prior year, the current year, and the proposed spending. So it's a 3-year fiscal document. So when you're reading it, don't get overwhelmed but it's pointing out what happened in 2019, and it's pointing out what happened in 2020, and then it's pointing out to 2022, 2023. The governor's budget is laid out in 3 fiscal years, and that's good because it shows us where we were, where we are, and where they're proposing to go. And as advocates who hold our government accountable, because we have our constituents that we represent, and we're seeing the direct needs and then the outcomes of these decisions, we could point out that, yes, that worked, or it's not working, or we need more resources to make these programs whole. The governor's summary is called the A pages. So if you ever hear A pages, that's the document that provides the governor's economic and revenue outlook. It highlights major policy initiatives and it summarizes the state's expenditure. Governor Brown was not verbose. Governor Brown would handle this in less than 150 pages. Today's A pages are about 300 to 400 pages long. So make sure you have ink in that printer and know that many of these documents are broken up by issue area. So don't go ahead and print 400 pages if your issue area is just housing. Just then focus on housing. And at the back of the A pages, it has the breakdown of the spreadsheets of where's the money coming from for each of those sources. So if you want the backup information, it's at the back end. The May revision updates the governor's economic and revenue outlook. It revises and withdraws proposals that were included in the January budget, and then adjusts expenditures. Again, after looking at the tax receipts from April, seeing who's paid and who hasn't, the state could either have more money or less money and has to make those adjustments here. So what's a BBL? Because we love our acronyms. A BBL is the budget bill language. It itemizes the appropriation, which authorizes state agencies to spend money on specific funds for a specific purpose. So when you look at BBL, I'm trying to remember which ones are BBL this time around, because we've had so many more bills than ever before. It itemizes by state agency. So it's numerical order, not alphabetical order. It's like a bank account, and it starts with each of the numbers, each of the organization's number, and it tells you this agency is going to receive so much money, and it details how much of that is for a specific purpose. The trailer bills, the TBLs, are the budget related bills that follow the appropriation document. So we have kind of like a checkbook stating this is how we're going to spend all of the state resources. And the statutory changes, which is your trailer bill, follows the budget. And those make the law changes related to the budget in order to modify and implement said budget. So Kai and Julian used to sit in all of these private meetings that people have no idea, but as I mentioned, there are budget hearings. Well, what people don't know is that there's something called a pre-hearing. Everything is kind of like a production. Once we go live and we get invited to the public hearing, the staff and the state agencies have already rehearsed. What questions are you going to ask me? What information should I bring forward so that in case your politicians ask, both the Democrats and Republicans are in the room and they grill Julian and Kai about, well, what about this program? How are you going to implement this program? How are you going to do this? Did you give us the statutory changes? And don't complain later because you didn't tell me when we were writing the trailer bill. Is that accurate, Kai and Julian? Yeah, don't complain later.
You're giving away all the state secrets. That's correct. You're correct.
So make sure that, as you know, the trailer bills are going to come out. We need to make sure that the language, that the information on how to implement these programs is done in a way that we know is going to be the most effective. We don't always get it right, because think about it. We're here managing, the state of California is managing $300 billion of state and federal funds. And then unfortunately, we've whittled down state government, and there's not that many professional staff who manage all of these issues. So they need our support. They need our help. They need our advice. They might just not know who you are until you let yourself be known. And so the trailer bill is very critical, because that gives us the instructions on how to implement a policy proposal and a budget proposal. The governor, even though the legislature can pass a budget to meet that June 15, and it has to be balanced now in order to be effective, the governor can still veto. That means that he can reject 100% and say, send it back. I don't want to see it, take it back, and reject a bill, a trailer bill, or the entire budget. The governor can also line item appropriations. And this legislature, with the 2/3 vote, can override a veto. So that's where this administration has to be very careful and very strategic in how they lobby their partners and how they make sure that they're successful in their own negotiations. There's something called the Department of Finance, which I had mentioned earlier under the governor's slide. The Department of Finance is the agency that relays and proposes and creates the governor's vision on the state budget process. There's a director of the Department of Finance. Keely has been around for a long time. Keely is an amazing human being. She used to be a budget consultant on the on general government side of the House for the Senate Budget and Fiscal Review. She was a former colleague. So that's really exciting to see her rise and her success. And her responsibility is to manage the entire state fiscal portfolio, and on behalf of a governor, negotiate that with the legislature, the Assembly, and the Senate leadership. As I had mentioned, Assembly Budget Committee and Senate Budget and Fiscal Review Committees, they're the ones who review these committees. They help develop the legislative agenda and the vision, and they release their own analysis beginning in January. So if you visit their websites, you could review today. What did they write? What was their platform? What did they want to focus on their Build Back Boldly plans? And then I love the LAO. I feel like we're sister organizations with the Legislative Analyst Office. They are the right hand to the legislature. They're a nonpartisan organization that analyzes and provides advice to the legislature. And they also release reports on their website. So if you want to read those reports, go to lao.ca.gov. We always read those reports to give us a different take on what the administration's proposing. And because they're nonpartisan, they really try to be as partial and fair when reviewing situations. And for advocates, we want to make sure we're giving them our take so that they could provide that in the advice that they provide to the legislature. So they're also a critical entity to consider when you're providing advice. And then I wanted to go ahead and pause here and see if there were any questions. Jake?
Yeah, can you hear me this time?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. I just wanted to ask maybe if you can touch on the difference between or relationship between an appropriations bill and a budget ask. Like, would you want to have to determine whether you want to do it through the appropriations process instead of the budget, or?
That's a great question. That's a great question. So his question is, how do I make a budget ask? Because in the end, you just want resources, right? So if you go through the legislative process, just know that that might take a lot longer to do, because a bill might not get fully heard in the first year. It might be delayed and heard in the second year of the legislative session. But in the end, if it's going to cost money, you still have to go to Department of Finance. You still have to talk to the governor's office, just as if you were making a budget request, and let them know that your bill costs so much money and that you're looking at the data, you're realizing the state is about to generate X amount in additional resources. Could those dollars be earmarked for this proposal? While you have a bill, nothing should stop you from shopping that bill idea to the budget consultants in the policy, in the fiscal committees on the Assembly and the Senate side. Nothing stops people. Let me tell you a successful story. TK, right? The transitional kindergarten. They have tried for 4 years to put themselves through a bill. That's how they were working the issue, through legislation. And it would always die in the appropriations committee, because we're talking about $3 billion, $3 billion. So it would die. And with Assemblymember McCarty from Sacramento, who's the author of said bill, he's also the sub-chair of the fiscal committee on the Assembly Budget Committee. So then this time around, he put it, and he got the legislature, the Assembly, to put it as part of their budget ask. And so when the Assembly negotiated, they said one of their must-haves is the $3 billion phased in. So not $3 billion in 1 year, but we're going to use 21, 22 as a planning year, and come 22, 23 is when schools will begin receiving the same amount of funding that we get for kindergartners for these students, because they're going to start adjusting the age, the birthdays of who can come into TK. Because right now it's very restrictive. It's 3 months, the last 3 months of the like September through November, right? And so it's very difficult. If your child fits that window, then they're eligible to participate. But it took a long time. And so what Assemblymember McCarty did, and his advocates, they put it in a bill. So that bill went through the process, and guess what? It got co-authors, got hearings that he then publicized through press releases. It got people coming and testifying, parents, communities, organizations, saying this is important. And then on the budget side, he held a informational hearing just on TK of why it matters and why it's important. So you could work both sides. Don't feel limited that you only because you have a bill, you can't then educate and pursue and advocate when you're in the policy shops and the fiscal shops, your idea. Kai or Julian, anything else that I should add on that? Jake,
Yeah.
just that.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add, but I mean, that's good to know. But you can work through both angles.
Yeah, and also sometimes, Jake, what ends up happening is when you're running it through a bill, right? Oftentimes, let me reframe that. Sometimes your bill will end up getting converted into the budget anyway, depending on what it is, right? Sometimes if the bill is actually aligned with, let's say, whatever the governor's platform might be, they'll oftentimes use the bill, right, to sort of work through some of those kinks in a very public way, right? That for the hearings, right, working with the advocates, working with legislators, and they'll work through that using the bill as the vehicle. And then before you know it, 11th hour, that bill will get pulled, and then those contents will get put into the budget. And then, everyone wins, right? I mean, it's a painful process to go that route, but lo and behold, right, if at the end of the day, the goal is to actually get those resources, how it gets there doesn't matter. We just needed to get there. And that's also a vehicle as to how folks might use a bill like Sada was just talking about. It does take longer, but sometimes more controversial pieces could get worked out through the hearing process, and then eventually into the budget and signed by the governor. I hope that didn't make that more confusing, but that's definitely a tactic.
All good, thank you.
So Stephanie says it's hard when they say they're moving it out of committee, and then the last day they are not moving it forward. Yes. And this goes back to not falling in love with our bills or our ideas. And it hurts. Like my husband's becoming a special education teacher. Something that I've been working on for the last 6 years has been reforming special education. And it's been hard, folks, not easy at all, but yet it's a population of students that we've neglected, that we ignore, that we haven't addressed, that you name it. My husband tells me every time he comes home. And it's very difficult. It's very difficult. But what I have to keep in mind is what's the price? Eye on the price. And that is educating folks, building a momentum, building coalition partners, because we can't do this alone. We have to have our partners. And so while you're working and while you're, as you mentioned, seeing that your bill's being held back, can that be another opportunity to educate more folks to be part of your movement? Can you spend then maybe the fall? This is a really critical time, folks. Don't waste the fall. In setting up meet and greets, setting up processes where you're doing briefing sessions, bringing those elected officials to you, letting them know this has not been recognized, and yet the state of California is about to hit another milestone and record revenues. Let's be strategic. Let's make sure that we're not leaving anyone behind, much less those that are the most in need, right? So these are time periods that we'll get into a little bit further that are very important to use this time wisely, to start activating and informing people so that when January hits, your ideas have made it that much further along. Okay, with that, if we don't have any more questions, I'm going to continue moving this presentation along. So why does it matter? As I mentioned yesterday, and I think it's important, I need to hear this information. So for those that heard it yesterday, I'm going to repeat it one more time. Why does advocacy matter? Because you are the subject matter expert. You know your story. You know this information, and they are your representatives. Not every elected official that comes to Sacramento is an expert in your issue area. However, there's a great opportunity to make a champion out of them. But are you communicating with them? Are you letting them know? Are you there setting up quarterly meetings, inviting them to meet and greets, inviting them to your key stakeholder input sessions? Because the thing is, if you're not there, someone else is. And so your opposition will always be there. Folks that are not interested, who are interested in the status quo, they're always there. They don't stop showing up. Folks that don't want to see reforms, they are so dedicated because it's not in their interest to change the system at all. And I think for nonprofit organizations, you're all mission driven. You all have a cause that you're advocating for. It unfortunately doesn't come with the billions of dollars from all these other like other organizations, right? But that doesn't mean that we can't elevate our voice through relationship building and through coalition building. So making sure that as you're creating your voice, creating your platform, fixing a cause and focusing on a primary goal, that you recognize who are going to be your stakeholders, who's going to be your opposition, and what are the counter answers to the opposition's requests. For us, and I gave this example yesterday, that we're part of a broadband coalition. We were successful in getting $6 billion from the state budget, from federal funds, to start building out the last and middle mile throughout the state of California. And AT&T and the Cable Association continue to release op-eds saying, we don't need that. The state of California is too bureaucratic. We will do it on our own. We've given parents during COVID a 60-day trial. I'm like, well, that's like AOL CDs. Thanks for the 200 hours, but is it reliable? Is it sufficient? Does it upload and download information? Or is it the lowest level because you don't think that low-income people should have access to quality instruction in a distance learning environment? And AT&T and T-Mobile and all those companies are not interested in what services schools render or what services were being rendered through other spaces. So we had to continue to advocate. So every time the California Cable Association comes up with something, I get a Google alert because I want to know what they're saying. always keep tabs on what the other side's saying. They don't have to necessarily be your opposition, but just know what are their talking points, because then you could come in with your facts, with your data and information of why your cause is still critical, and let your elected officials know, because you're the subject matter experts. So that's why it matters. So making sure that when you're identifying and planning for your advocacy efforts, again, make sure you all know what's the issue at hand. Make sure that you're being thorough, that you're communicating, that we're going to focus. We have this huge, and this is the problem sometimes with education. We have so many problems. we could really take it out everywhere. But the problem is with that is then we're not rowing in one direction with clarity. And we have to focus on what's going to be the key issue for this year, for this month, for this time period, until we resolve it. So make sure that as you identify your issue, you set clear goals and objectives on how to accomplish them. So have a strategy and then have your tactics. How are you going to educate the legislature? How are you going to educate the administration, the governor's office and Department of Finance? Can you partner with a research firm that's already undertaking a report and highlight the data from that report? Also knowing, is this an issue that can be addressed at the state, federal, or local level? And make sure that when you establish a message, it's clear that everyone in your circle, everyone in your coalition understands what are the talking points and what's the ask. Don't forget the ask. The last thing you need to do as you're meeting and setting up meet and greets and advocacy days is to forget to make the ask, because then you'll step out and go, did they know what I said? What did we ask? Do we even ask anything? That's so embarrassing, because you just wasted the time. And as a staffer, you're like, well, that was a great meeting. I don't know what the ask was, so I'm just going to file it in info only. We don't want to live in info only. We want to be in active, the active mode. So make sure you're being active and proactive, and then develop your action plan. Make sure that you have all of these areas covered, that you're being strategic, that you know who your touch points are. Kai mentioned on the chat box that don't wait until that hearing date to start communicating. Everything needs to be handled beforehand. As I mentioned, there's something called a pre-hearing. So there's a trial on a Friday before the hearing happens on a Tuesday or Wednesday. And they rehearse they go through the entire agenda page by page. This is issue 1. We're going to ask the following questions. Department of Finance, you better have your information. LAO, you will have your backup information. State agency, do you have any comments? Next issue. But if we as advocates haven't communicated to any of those stakeholders in that secret room, are we in that space? Have we planted a seed of thought that maybe, although that's a great idea, it could be reinforced if we did X, Y, and Z? Or instead of doing that great idea, because it may not be so great, can we redirect and reuse those resources for something that actually will have a bigger impact in our communities? So remember, there are spaces that we may not be physically allowed in, like pre-hearings, but if we plant the seeds in the right constituents, we might have a chance of being successful in the end. So preparing your story, think about how your proposal, how your budget request, like Jake had mentioned, you have a bill, but it costs money. Let folks know these are the implications and why we're making this why we're making this request. What is the actual impact? Back up your story with facts. Don't let people know that you heard something. Make sure that it's your story. Or if you did hear something, make sure that you have the information and cover your bases in case someone asks. I would like to have a follow-up conversation with that nonprofit that you said experienced this, this, and that. Make sure that it's real life examples. The last thing we need, and for education advocates, it's very challenging. We have 1,300 school districts. CASBA represents about 700. So we're almost there in terms of how many districts we represent statewide. But I need to make sure that if I'm going to say suburban school districts are experiencing this, that I have talked to the Suburban School Districts Association representative, that I have done my homework in surveying that population of districts, because what the suburbans are experiencing might be completely different from the urbans. So I need to make sure that my examples correlate with the information that I'm trying to share. So be careful in how you lay out your story, and just remember, you are the subject matter expert. This is your story to tell. No better messenger than you all in this room. And then give it the human perspective. Don't come in here, because I got a few hearts on my special ed story, but I hit home of why those kids matter. I gave it a human experience instead of saying, well, statistically, the state of California only receives 9% of our overall allocation instead of 40%, which was promised 40 years ago. That doesn't get me that far, right? That's really dry. I don't care. You'll be like, 40% out of 9. I don't know what she's talking about. Okay, I'll write that down and file it in my info only box. We don't want to do that to staffers. Let's not torture them. Those poor souls are in 40 to 50 meetings a day with their elected officials. Let's be proactive and give them something they'll feel energized, that they'll want to be like, oh, I did not know this was happening to my constituents. I need to tell my assembly member. I need to tell my senator. That's not fair. That's not right. That needs to be resolved. So make sure to give it a human perspective. And if you need practice, there's 3 of us here. Feel free to practice on us. I'm very blunt. I'll tell you, no. I'll press the buzzer, because sometimes we need to practice. And yes, we get passionate, and I get very passionate, and I know my data, but is it the right story at the right time? Now, if I was with the legislative analyst office, I'm totally telling them about my 40% lack of funding, and it's really 9%, because those are the analysts who focus on that information. But I'm not going to say that story to an assembly member or a senator's education policy staffer, because they're not that in the weeds in that level of information. So knowing your issue, making sure that everyone, when you go in, regardless of being a legislative meeting for a policy idea or a budget. And so what I've been noticing as I've been talking to different stakeholders, because I don't only live with K through 12 stakeholders, I do work with our early education. I work with on the health side, when we were making requests for PPE and different products to remain open and to reopen schools, people get really excited. And they're also representing their own constituency. So if we're going in a coalition with multiple voices, right? Housing, human services, education, what have you, everyone needs to be on the same page. Because if we all go in there and someone says, hey, let me talk to you first. What's the ask? And you start talking about your specific organization versus the coalition at hand versus the policy issue at hand, the budget request at hand, that meeting's done. You've lost your audience, because now we're all going to focus on this one specific issue. And that may not have been the top thing that we really were intended to come in here as a coalition. I'm part of the education coalition group. So it's management and labor with PTA. Management and labor are not always on the same page. But when we go in under the label of education coalition, we have to act and sound and talk like we're speaking with one voice. And sometimes that's very challenging, because people are people, and sometimes they get their feelings hurt. But in those spaces, we have to go in with one voice. And so reminding the folks that you take, hey, get your words out of your system. If you want to focus on something else, we'll focus on that other item at a different meeting. But this meeting is for this issue. What's the meeting for? For this issue. What are we going to discuss? These topics. And make sure that you're using your advocacy's website. So you could check out various organizations' websites. There's an association for everything. There's an almond association, there's a dental association, there's a medical association, there's a nurses association. There's 5 different kinds of management associations for schools. And then you have labor. So everyone has a website that's active on the advocacy side. Feel free to dabble and just review if it's based on the issue you want, to learn about the key topics that they're working on, to get just familiar with the lingo. And so that you could start figuring out, okay, how do I best create my handout, my 101 document? Don't fill it up with tons of words, because again, these staffers and politicians are meeting with 40 to 50 different groups, 10-minute increments. And something that was mentioned yesterday by Michael, who works for Senator Leyva, and I want to reinforce this information, is don't feel bad if you cannot meet with the politician and you're redirected to just talk to the staffer. Don't know how many times when I was the budget consultant and people had to meet with me, people would roll their eyes and be like, oh, okay, well, now I know how this meeting's going to go. I'm going to file that in my info only box. So don't treat staff bad. They are the ears, memory, and eyes of politicians. They're sitting next to the politician, taking it all in. And so don't neglect them and don't feel disrespected. Remember the schedules that I showed you on the policy side and the budget side. These politicians are running to go sit in and be part of a hearing as the members of that committee, or they're running to go testify on their own issue areas. We barely let them eat. I don't think they're humans, because they're all over the place. And so again, it's how you go in and how you're going to treat that meeting. That's what you'll get out of it. So being respectful, being courteous, and recognizing that they may be stuck somewhere they don't want to be, because they're a member of a committee that has a gazillion bills, like education committee that has 400 bills at a time, and they're stuck there and they can't leave, because it is their duty to review each of those bills and make decisions on behalf of their constituents. And make sure that everyone's asking the same request, either support or opposition of a particular legislation or budget proposal, or something that you're all introducing collectively. Now, if someone wants to veer off, just remember, you might derail both your veering off topic and the one at hand. So be careful, be respectful to your coalition members, because that's how this world is all about reputations and who we know. And we remember those people who we don't want to know. Those people are memorable and they stay in the info only box. So make sure that when you get involved, you're providing input throughout the process, the budget policy process. It's very hectic, 9 months total. So just know that as we approach December, politicians are looking for ideas. So if you do have a policy bill, start pitching it to them. Start setting up meetings and saying, hey, we really are interested in addressing this issue. Do you think it's something that can be done administratively through the legislative process? They have legal counsel. They have lawyers that could then they vet their ideas through their legislative counsel to see, is this something that needs to be fixed through this process? Make sure to document. Don't feel embarrassed that you might need to submit a letter. Don't think that a letter doesn't mean anything. A letter might be more significant because, again, these poor staffers are sitting through so many meetings, and when they debrief with their chief of staff, their legislative director, and their member, they could cite your information and say, this organization specifically requests the following things. Be clear in your letter. Don't write a 3-page novel that still doesn't tell me what's my ask and what are the key facts. Make sure that your letter is concise. Keep it under 2 if possible. You could put charts in the back, but very clean and to the point. I respectfully request X. Your constituents are impacted by X, Y, and Z. And these are the possible solutions. You know, just think of your audience. They are overworked, overwhelmed, but they're public servants who want to help. Everyone in that office, in that Capitol, I feel like 99% of the people that work there really do care to be the best public servant that they can be. But we are responsible for helping them get there because you are the subject matter experts. And then stay connected with these key players. You don't know where a Capitol staffer who was once a ledge aide will be in a year from now. The Capitol turns over so quickly because there's so much opportunity in Sacramento. Some person could be the ledge aide one day and then the ledge director 2 months later. And if you went in with an attitude, that legislative director will now remember you and tell their staffer, if you ever see that person, let them know that they could wait. And that's the worst situation to find yourself. So getting involved. You have Julian's contact information. Make sure to hit him up and make sure that this goes somewhere. You have the tools at your disposal. You know that you could help vet proposals. You could start thinking about it as your region. How do these proposals affect us as a region? And how can we start submitting comments through testimonies, through public hearings, through stakeholder input sessions, and through writing campaigns to let them know these proposals, these issues are what are the forefront issues in our community. Sponsor legislation, stop being scared. You know your issues. And guess what? These legislators, their job is to legislate. Give them something good to legislate. They're always seeking ideas. And sponsor a host a Legislator of the Year award. Your region has a lot of great actors. You have a lot of champions. You really are building a community of legislators who are becoming seasoned, who are in leadership positions. So don't miss an opportunity to activate them. And then if you have quarterly meetings, if you have a board meeting that you could take some time in and introduce them to your coalition, to your organization, to your key stakeholders, imagine what that will mean for them. And remember, assembly members are seeking election every 2 years. Senators, 4 years. Next year is a election year. So this is the time to get involved and get them to your community because they need those votes. And so invite them to your community events. If you're doing an open home, you're doing a ribbon cutting ceremony, invite them. They might not show up the first time around. They'll send their staff. But now you have a contact. So don't miss an opportunity. And then, as I mentioned yesterday, this is the cycle of the advocacy process. It's always ongoing. It never ends, but it's always exciting. There are huge peaks wherein it's super busy from January to June. Then we take a break in August or in July for next year. And then knowing that you can participate, submit your letters, testify, especially if we remain virtually, you could testify from the comfort of your own home. And then making sure that if you have a cause, someone said that they're part of an autism society, are you signed up to their calls to action? So when there's a bill relating to special education, that you are activated and that you could also then send out your request. And we're still in October, folks. This month is going by way too fast, but we're still in October. And guess what elected officials are telling their staff? Where's my bill package? What ideas are we going to shop around? And Julian, who was with a superintendent who was very active as a former legislator and would like to co-sponsor a lot of legislation. It was Julian's job to go up and down the floors of CDE and be like, do you have a bill idea? Do you have a bill idea? Where's our bill idea? Where's our bill idea? Someone give me a bill idea. I need to come up with 24 bill ideas. So remember, people are looking for ideas, but are we available to give those ideas to these folks? Have we made ourselves aware and are we active in the process so that people know to reach out to you when they need a bill idea?